Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. In this episode, I'll be making a cutting board with a basket weave pattern, something a bit different to the straightforward strips of wood glued together. The design of the cutting board was first drawn up in CAD. I use a package called Rhino 6, and as you can see, I was able to set out the individual block sizes and work out how many of each I would need. In the second image, you can see the layout of the blocks to form the pattern. For this project, I only made the board half the size of the plan, so 400mm by 280mm. I used the jointer to put two planed sides on each piece of timber. I didn't need to plane all four sides as I would be cutting it down to size on my bandsaw for both thickness and width. With that done, I used the bandsaw to cut the timber to the required sizes. The timber I'm using is Padauk for the small squares, Sapele for the main blocks, with beech banding for contrast. I am using my new Laguna 1412 bandsaw. It has a 4 tooth per inch by 3/4 inch wide blade installed. This is so much better than using my Bosch table saw. I feel safer and the quality of cut is excellent. The clip is sped up by 2.5 times. The next clip is normal speed, and I think it's fair to say it takes longer to cut a piece of timber, but I prefer this any day compared to a table saw. In this clip, I am cutting the 5mm beech banding. The cut was accurate and very clean. The more I did, the more confident I got using it. In my next episode, you will see me cutting much bigger pieces of timber, which is the main reason I bought a saw with such a big cutting depth. Next was the glue up. For this I am using Titebond 3. It gives a longer working time and is very strong and food safe after it's cured. I'm also using new sash clamps. You can never have too many of these, as they say. The glue up was straightforward. I had to glue a 5mm strip of beech to each side of a 20mm strip of Sapele. I applied the glue only to one side of the beech and placed the glued up pieces back to back, and at each side I placed another piece of timber to act as a caul to spread the clamping pressure. And with the addition of multiple clamps, I finished for the day and left everything to cure overnight. It's the next day and time to release the clamps. I was a bit concerned the glue would have turned the whole thing into a solid piece of laminate, but no need to worry. With a bit of persuasion from a scraper, the pieces came apart easily. The glue squeeze out needed to be scraped off. Then I checked the width of each piece. I was looking for 30mm or there or thereabouts. These pieces averaged out at 32ish, so with the glue scraped off, I used a large drum sander to gently sand them down to the required 30mm. passed each piece through the sander to flatten them all to the same thickness, then each piece went through taking equal amounts off each side until the required width of 30mm was achieved. The sander made short work of getting them to 30mm, so with that done, I moved over to the bandsaw to cut the individual blocks, 184 of them to be precise, with a few left over for spares. Once again, the bandsaw was perfect for this. With the addition of the mitre fence, I was able to cut each set of blocks with consistent accuracy, and in no time at all, I had them all cut ready for assembly. Moving on to assembly, with all the pieces cut and the rough edges sanded, I prepared the gluing base. Basically a piece of MDF with a plastic cover so the glue wouldn't stick to it. I used a brush for the first few pieces, but then I opted to use the dipping method for glue application. A bit more wasteful than brushing each piece, but time was of the essence. All of the pieces would need to be assembled before I could clamp it together, and I wasn't sure how long the glue would last after it started to soak into the wood. The following clips are speeded up 5 times. The individual blocks went down quite well. The biggest issue was getting them down in the correct order, but once I got into the rhythm, it was plain sailing. The thing that did catch me out was the amount of glue that I used to complete it. I had ordered an extra bottle just in case I needed it. In total, I used a full 16-ounce 473ml bottle and half of an 8-ounce bottle. So in total, I used around 20 ounces or 566 millilitres. the last few blocks installed, I clamped the whole thing using as many clamps as I could. I used strips of HDPE on all four sides against the glued faces. This would not stick and would not need to be cut off after the glue had cured. Before fully tightening the clamps, I hammered the blocks down to get them as level as possible. I had noticed the middle section was lifting, and I couldn't work out why, but using some gentle persuasion, everything seemed to seat down correctly. And with the remaining clamps added, and everything fully tightened down, I left it overnight for the glue to cure. It's the next day and all seems well. The glue was cured nicely, so I removed the clamps and got it ready for levelling on the drum sander. Some of the glue had collected underneath the board. This had to be scraped off. A bit of a messy job, but I used sawdust to soak it up and it cleaned up nicely. The sanding was up next. In an ideal world I would have preferred to use a planer thicknesser with a 13-inch wide spiral cutting head, but I don't own one of those, so my drum sander is the next best thing. I began with very light passes around 1/64 of an inch on a very slow feed, alternating each side and rotating it to create as level a surface as possible. The sanding took a while to do. I had 100 grit sandpaper installed. Next time I will start with 80 grit to get to level, then go up to the finer grits. But this is way better than trying to do it by hand. That would be a lot of work. Up next, I sanded the edges with the large disc sander, making sure to keep the board perpendicular to the sanding disc. This made a great job and left all the sides nice and square to the top. I used the 1/4 inch router to add a 6mm round over to the edges. I set the cutter to leave a slight lip around the top and bottom. This gave me something to sand down to and not sand away the radius. With the roundovers done, I went over all the surfaces with a palm sander working up to 240 grit. As with the wood turning, I won't bore you with the whole process. I decided to cut some recessed handholds. For these I used a 1/4 inch router fitted with a 10x18mm radius cutter. I used this to give the internal edges a nice radius and to remove the bulk of the material. Then I used a straight cutting bit to flatten the bottom. I went over the recesses with a palm sander and gave all the surfaces one last fine sanding before drilling 4 pilot holes for the rubber feet. I made a jig to drill the pilot holes for the feet, and with that done, it was time for the finish. In this case, food safe mineral oil. Brandon Bespoke high-grade mineral oil, applied liberally. Initially I used a plastic scraper to spread the oil, but in the end, just rubbing it in with my hands proved to be the best method. I made sure all the surfaces were well covered and I placed it to one side for 24 hours. The next day, I cleaned the excess oil away with clean paper towel, ready for the final finish. Brandon Bespoke Food Safe Wax Oil Treatment. This was applied with a clean paper towel and buffed off to achieve a nice deep sheen. The last job to finish it off was to fit the rubber feet in the pre-drilled holes. And that's it, another project finished. Something a bit different to the usual wood turning. I really enjoyed making this one and I hope you like this episode too. If I could please ask you to subscribe, hit that like button and leave a comment. I enjoy reading them. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.